Yes, that's clear. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks. And thank you, Jim, for an excellent overview. I think you've brought a lot of perspective into what's happening in industry. So I'm going to kind of deep dive a little into the perspective from a safety perspective and what happens when you look at this technology shifts in supply chain and what does it do to the safety profession and to ensuring safety and security. So clearly, I think this is of importance to the SDG goals, because as I see it, there are two direct goals which are linked to the sustainable development goals. These are two related things. But on a more, coming back to the topic, I think the question we have to ask ourselves is that as we go through the storm, so to say, what is it going to take to ensure that we have a supply chain that's resilient, reliable, and responsive? And end of the day, if it's able to assure that safety and security that we're looking for, because that's end of the day what we're looking for. And I would argue that there are three things that it requires, which is really, one is capacity, two is control, and three is competence. And I'm going to deep dive into each of these in just a moment. So these, I think, are the essential requirements for a supply chain to deliver what it's supposed to be doing and to be resilient, reliable, and responsive. Capacity, what do I mean by capacity? Simple, it's all about deployment of the resources that we have, whether it be money or manpower or material or methods or machines, whatever we have, to the global facilities that we want, where we want to get it done. So it's really about deployment of the resources, the places from where you want to get that work undertaken. When it comes to controls, here is, for those of you who may not be safety professionals on this call, here is a risk management 101 course. So safety is all about, it starts with the hazards, the existence of the hazard, whatever be the nature of hazard could result in an incident or an accident, which in turn could result in some kind of a consequence, which may be bad, maybe just an injury, or maybe a fatality in some cases. Now, not everything is going to be like that. There's a probability that this would happen, and there's a severity associated with every incident. And the combination of this probability and severity is what we typically term as risk. Okay. Now, the reality is that this is how it would function if we didn't do anything. But the only reason why things work, and the only reason why professionals like safety professionals, security professionals exist, is because they are putting in place those controls, the control to ensure that that hazard is either eliminated, or even if it's still there, that it doesn't come in the way and doesn't cause an accident or an incident, or even if it causes an accident or incident, put in a control to ensure that it actually minimizes the consequence and you're staying safe. So these controls are what are going to really decide how safe or how secure your system is. The third point is competence, because at the end of the day, you can have all of these controls, you can have all of the capacity, but then where the rubber hits the road, it's eventually that individual on the ground who's really going to be there and get this work done. And if he or she doesn't have the required competence, you're going to have a trouble in really getting the job done. So we need that competency on the ground as well. So let's kind of ask ourselves this question now. What's going to happen to these three C's because of COVID-19? What are the stressors on these three C's as we move into COVID-19, as we look at this post-COVID era, or even the COVID era for that matter? First one, there is going to be stress in capacity. I mean, investments are drying down. Companies which are relying on foreign investments and others are going to have an issue of not having enough resources coming up. On the other hand, you're also going to have manpower-related issues. There was a recent ILO report which talked about a very large pool of people who are going to be losing their livelihoods, a large number of them in the unorganized sector or the SMEs or the other sectors. So these are people who are going to be losing their jobs, and there's going to be stress on capacity wherever it is. On the other hand, like Jim alluded to, there are also going to be possibly talent gaps in many areas where you need some advanced talent. But when it comes to the common man on the floor trying to eke out a living, I think you're going to have a large number of those people who are going to be looking for jobs. And of course, there was, again, a recent Economist article which talked about the shift to automation, and Jim also alluded to this point. That's going to be driving up because of the redeployment of machines and methods to different ways of working. That's also going to be driving and putting some stress on capacity. And also, you also have this issue of people wanting to relook at their supply chains and say that if this is the way it worked today, maybe I need to do nearshoring. So there's the deglobalization effect where you're essentially trying to realign your supply chains and see where are we actually getting work done. Now, I mean, these are all just, these are not representing any particular business or any particular industry, but I'm just stressing on the point that you're going to be seeing a lot of movement in capacity, and that's going to kind of put some stress on whether this capacity is going to be coming in the way of safe and secure operations. Because the question really is, when we are realigning this capacity, could we be compromising on our ability of the system to deliver the necessary results, whether it be safety or security? So that's a question we would ask ourselves. And I don't know the answer to that question right now. Okay, let's move on to controls. And when I talk of controls, I'm talking about what are some of the stressors that are going to come. This is an incident that happened just yesterday. It's about a gas plant, a gas leak in a polymer plant in the city of Visakhapatnam in India. Now this happened because there was something new happened because these people had shut down for a large number of days, and again, it was a restart. And I don't believe, possibly, and I'm just speculating here, but maybe they didn't have the necessary protocols to do a formal restart. And that in turn resulted in an accident, an undesirable incident, which killed quite a few people. You're going to have other similar incidents happening. As a matter of fact, one of the big shifts that you're going to be seeing is really about the job losses, which in turn are also going to be contributing towards this whole concept of presenteeism. Presenteeism is what we mean, for those who are not familiar, it's that people who are not supposed to be at work end up being at work, and they cause a lot more problems because they could be, especially in the post-COVID era, you realize that a person, maybe for fear of his job, is going to end up coming to work, and he doesn't want to stay away from home because he's afraid that he may lose his job. And when he comes to work, he's probably going to be impacting a lot more people when he comes on board. So this is another problem that you've got to deal with. There are going to be stresses on those controls. So what it's essentially doing is going back to that hazard thing. It's going to be introducing new hazards that we didn't conceptualize earlier on. And those are going to be putting stress on the controls. So as we were de-risking and as we were realigning our supply chain, making it more agile, have we essentially identified those unforeseen hazards, and have we put in place potential controls to address those unforeseen hazards? So that's again a question to ask ourselves. The third point I want to stress on is about the ability of the people to operate under the new normal. We spoke about job losses. We spoke about, migrant labor, not coming back to work. So there are going to be a lot of new people entering the workforce, and there are going to be people who are probably going to find it difficult to work under the new normal. And if that's going to be putting a lot more stress on the system, because on the one hand, there's a lot of knowledge that may have been established or may have been gained over several years of work. And if those people are going to be losing their jobs and you're getting fresh workers who are probably not necessarily aware of all of those controls that are required for work, you might be having a situation where that could be adding further stress to the whole situation. And, the competence could be playing a role in essentially contributing to a lack of safety or a lack of security. So the question to ask ourselves is, in the new normal, could we be using technology smartly to manage the 3 C's? And I'm not saying these are mutually exclusive, though they're put as separate boxes, because they are in many ways related. So what I want to do is, I want to walk through 3 specific examples of how some of our clients have been using technology really in a smart way to address capacity, controls, and competence. Like I said, there's an overlap, but never mind that. So capacity, I have an example from a client of mine who's a global distributor, actually in the supply chain industry. It's not exactly a manufacturing example, but nevertheless, I think it's a classic example. So their problem was really about how to rapidly align the networks when there's a changing situation on the ground. And that solution was fairly simple. That solution was, we've got a lot of tacit knowledge that we have acquired over 20 plus years of operating the business. How do we essentially make this knowledge available to all of those new people who are coming into the system? And how do we make sure that they can come up to speed very quickly? So that's something which they spent almost a year and a half to put this together, putting all of the tacit knowledge. And I know tacit knowledge is not easy, because this is knowledge that's been acquired and it's not necessarily something which you can read up, but it's something which they concentrated and made an effort to put that tacit knowledge and made it available to any newcomer. And they made sure that this newcomer was essentially able to ramp up and understand his ability to kind of operate under the system. So this is something which I think is, if you look at it, the parallel to it is, as we have people working in our industries, as we have experienced individuals, I think it's very, very important to have a mechanism to gather that tacit knowledge, organize that knowledge and ensure that any newcomer who's coming into the system is also in a position to essentially jump in and get that knowledge and disseminate that knowledge. And there's also mechanisms in which you can test whether that knowledge is adequately absorbed or adequately assimilated. So that's a classic example. And I don't think, and I've worked a lot of manufacturing industries, I don't believe that we do a good job of this. I think there's a lot of knowledge that's existing in the heads of people, but it doesn't necessarily translate, and it doesn't necessarily get down to the individuals who are supposed to be actually working on the job. So that's something which you address. That's how technology can possibly address capacity. The second example, I want to talk about a client of ours, KB Associates, who's essentially in the HSE audit and inspection field, and a training company as well. So their problem statement was really about how do we ensure that all of those new controls that are there, how do we manage with those new controls on the job? What's the mechanism we can to address those new controls? So we're working with them for building up a specific technological product where you use a digital technology. You use a mobile platform basically to see how you could undertake and gather information on the ground about some of those compliance related issues. How do we understand what's the risk that's on the ground, and are the risk factors being captured? And then we have an algorithm that really helps them to go back and say that, given the fact that we have captured all of this information, what are some of those high risk areas where we probably need to do excessive monitoring? So this is through simple technologies of cloud and digital and geotagging and all that stuff. So you have a mechanism through which today you can essentially track and figure out where are those high risk areas where my controls may not actually be working to the extent that they need to work. So this is another classic example of how technology can be used. This is work in progress. We piloted it, but we still think we have a long way to go with this. The last example I want to give for competence is one which is, again, global in nature. This is the International Maritime Contractors Association. And again, they have a dispersed base of commercial diving supervisors, all of whom are very experienced, but at the same time, the industry is a high-risk industry. It's an industry in which there are a large number of incidents that happen. There's a lot of knowledge that's gathered from these incidents. And these incidents, if the supervisors aren't kind of familiar with those new issues that have come up, they are likely to maybe make those same mistakes, and we don't learn from those mistakes. So what IMCA has done, and I think it's a classic and a very good example of how you could be using technology smartly, they've put together what is called as a competency development framework, which is called CPD, continual professional development, where all of the curated knowledge from the news flashes and all of the information that they've gathered by way of these newsletters are made in the form of gamified content, which is made available to these supervisors. These supervisors are supposed to go through this in a periodic manner, and unless they complete these modules, they're probably not going to be on the approved supervisors list for the next year. So this is a great way of essentially ensuring that people who are probably grandfathered into the system, who've been in the system for long, are now made current with all of these new regulations and the new requirements which are happening on a day-to-day basis. Couple that with the fact that this is a world in which there's so much of information that's happening and so much of misinformation that's happening. So IMCA has also used the same platform for saying, how can we essentially inform these people about a new change, and how can we do that rapidly? Because we need them to know when there's a new requirement, and we need them to know like immediately. There's no time lag that's available. So this platform is also used really to go back and explain to them how a new requirement needs to come in place and how that impacts their job. So that's another classic example. So bottom line is, I think there is simple technology that's available today to address all the areas of capacity, controls, and competency. So my light bulb moment for the last few months is about, in post-COVID really, is about the fact that I've grown up with a standards background, and I've largely been a systems and standards person. But I think one of the biggest learnings for me is that during times of crisis, a standard operating procedure alone may not suffice. As a matter of fact, it may be counterproductive. We need to start looking at something called a dynamic operating procedure to complement those standard operating procedures. Just as SOP alone may not be enough. You need DOPs to go along with your SOPs if you want to do that. Simple example, do I wear a mask or not? I mean, there are instructions like these which keep changing from day in and day out. What are the controls that we need to put in place today? So these are all changing situations, and I think it's extremely important that we don't look hereafter if people are working. It's not about displaying in a standard operating procedure somewhere, but also having a mechanism through which, ideally digitally, providing them with a dynamic operating procedure which complements their standard operating procedures. I'm not suggesting that you throw away your SOPs. This is probably a good time for you to relook at those SOPs, but I think it's also a good time to see how do we complement it with DOPs. And again, I know we talked about advanced technologies like artificial intelligence and machine learning and all that stuff, which is great, but I also think that the existing digital and cloud technologies can easily support many of these initiatives. Particularly if you're an SME, I think you can have plug-and-play systems today that help you to get started. You don't necessarily need the next big wave, and you don't necessarily need to get overwhelmed by those terms like artificial intelligence and machine learning. That's great, but I think till it becomes mainstream, rely on existing technologies which are there. What's the technology which your SME worker uses the most? Probably a hand phone. How can you get a dynamic operating procedure to your operator on a hand phone? That's the question you've got to be asking yourself. So don't get overwhelmed by those technologies. That's my message. So my last slide really is about saying that when we talk about supply chain resilience, reliability, and responsiveness, it's never going to be an accident. It's really about focusing on those 3 C's: capacity, controls, and competence. And going back to a definition I said last year when I was at Vienna, I think it's important to remember that safety is not the absence of an incident or an accident. It's about the presence of these C's. If you have a system where it can take that capacity, it can have the necessary controls and the flexible controls and competent people to manage, I think you have a good, safe, and reliable system. So that's my 2 cents, and thank you, and I look forward to questions. Thanks, UNIDO, for having this opportunity to speak in this forum.
Thanks, JC. Some really great points there, and particularly like your case studies that you presented. And interestingly, they cover a number of the topics that we're starting to see on the Q&A. So just a reminder, if you've got a burning question,